Let's dive straight into the thick of it. We're looking at how Descartes tries to break the Cartesian circle, that pesky loop where you need certainty to establish the rule for certainty. The text points out an initial puzzle. How does knowing the truth rule, that clear and distinct perception is reliable, actually make our recollected perceptions unshakable against skeptical doubts? The argument presented here starts with a psychological observation. An unshakable belief is one that arguments just can't budge. If the skeptical idea can shake our memories, but knowing the truth rule supposedly makes them unshakable, then this knowledge of the rule must somehow clash psychologically with the skeptical idea itself. And Descartes seems to back this up in his second replies. He says once you know God exists, you can only doubt clear and distinct perceptions if you imagine God as a deceiver. But wait, he adds, you can't even imagine an all-perfect God being a deceiver. So if God exists, clear and distinct perception can only be faulty if God is a deceiver. Since imagining God as a deceiver is impossible, it follows that knowing God exists makes it psychologically impossible to suppose clear and distinct perception is defective. This psychological incompatibility looks like the key mechanism. Okay, so we have this idea that knowing the truth rule secures unshakability. But there's a wrinkle. Let's distinguish between two states: having a current, vivid, clear, and distinct perception of the truth rule versus just remembering you had such a perception earlier. When the belief that clear and distinct perception is true is a current, irresistible perception itself, Descartes argues it's psychologically impossible to even entertain the skeptical hypothesis. Think of it like trying to hold two contradictory thoughts in your mind at once. It just doesn't compute. You can't simultaneously believe P and P is false when P is something you're currently, vividly perceiving. But here's the problem. What about when the truth rule is just a recollection? When you remember you figured it out before, but aren't actively thinking through the proof right now? That recollection, unlike the current perception, isn't psychologically irresistible. It's weaker. And because it's weaker, it's psychologically compatible with the skeptical supposition. The evil demon idea could creep in, and suddenly, those previously solid beliefs based on clear and distinct perception might wobble. They're not unshakable anymore in that state. So the crucial insight here is that just remembering you knew the truth rule isn't enough. For unshakability, especially against skeptical challenges, you need more than just a memory. You need the psychological force of the current perception, or something equivalent. So we have this tension. Current perceptions are unshakable, recollections aren't. How does Descartes bridge this gap? The text proposes a clever distinction. Maybe Descartes isn't talking about absolute, unbreakable fortress walls of belief, but rather about having the keys to the fortress. Let's call the first kind strong unshakability, a belief so solid that no argument could ever make you doubt it, like a philosophical bedrock. The second kind is weak unshakability. You possess the arguments, the reasoning, the ability to defend your belief against any counter-argument. You can prevent it from being shaken, even if someone tries to shake it. Now, look at Descartes' words in the fifth meditation, paragraph 15. After establishing the truth rule, he says, "There are no counter-arguments which can be adduced to make me doubt it." The Latin word impellere used here is interesting. It can mean force, strong sense, or cause or lead, weak sense. The French version uses obliger, meaning oblige or compel. This suggests he's not saying doubt is literally impossible, but rather that doubt cannot be forced upon you. You have the power to resist it. Think of it like this. An armed robber might force you to hand over money, strong sense. But a skilled negotiator might cause you to relinquish money without forcing you, perhaps because you failed to use your own means of defense, weak sense. Similarly, an argument might cause you to doubt, but if you have the ability to reproduce the proof of the truth rule, you can exercise that ability and prevent the doubt from taking hold. So Descartes seems to be aiming for this weaker but still valuable notion of unshakability. So, how do we get from weak unshakability to actually securing our beliefs against doubt? The text introduces the reproducibility account. This is the core mechanism proposed to explain how remembering the truth rule can still provide security. even if the memory itself isn't psychologically irresistible. Here's the logic chain. 1. You remember proving the truth rule. Right now, though, you're not running through the steps. 2. Just remembering the conclusion is psychologically compatible with the skeptical idea. The demon could still whisper in your ear. 3. But here's the crucial part. You retain the ability to reproduce that demonstration. You haven't forgotten the logic. 4. When the skeptical doubt starts to arise, you can activate that ability. You can mentally run through the proof again. 5. By doing so, you generate a current, irresistible belief in the truth rule. The psychological force returns. 6. This irresistible belief then blocks the skeptical supposition. The doubt gets pushed back. 7. Therefore, even though the initial recollection was compatible with doubt, the fact that you can reproduce the proof means you have the means to prevent doubt. Your belief remains unshakable in the weak sense. The key qualification is that the sufficiency of the recollection depends on retaining the ability to reproduce the proof. It's not just about remembering you knew, it's about remembering how you knew and being able to re-access that knowledge when needed. Now, this reproducibility account leads to an interesting asymmetry. Not all remembered beliefs are treated the same way. We need to distinguish between basic propositions and non-basic propositions. Basic propositions are the foundational stones. These are the ideas essential to proving the main truth rule itself. Things like principles of causality, the existence of God, the idea that deception is an imperfection, and the conclusion that God is therefore no deceiver. Even the truth rule itself counts as basic for its own demonstration. Non-basic propositions are the structures built on top of these foundations. Think of geometric theorems that you proved after establishing the truth rule. They rely on the foundation, but aren't part of building it. The reproducibility account says that the ability to reproduce the proof of the truth rule provides unshakability for all remembered clear and distinct perceptions, both basic and non-basic. Why? Because the truth rule is the ultimate guarantor against skeptical doubt for all such beliefs. However, this creates a dependency. To be able to reproduce the proof of the truth rule, you must first be able to reproduce the proofs of its basic components, like God's existence. You can't build the house if you don't know how to lay the bricks. This leads to a special case. What about the basic propositions themselves? Can you forget how to prove God exists, yet still claim that belief is unshakable? The text argues no. For basic propositions, their unshakability also requires retaining the ability to reproduce their own demonstrations. You can't validate the foundation by having forgotten how it was constructed in the first place. It's a bit like saying, you can't trust your reasoning abilities if you've forgotten the principles of logic. Does Descartes actually say all this? Or is this interpretation reading too much into the text? The author tackles this head-on by examining the relevant passages. The main texts where Descartes claims recollection secures unshakability are the Fifth Meditation, para 15, and the Letter to Regius. The key phrase is often, even if I am no longer attending to the arguments which led me to judge that this is true, as long as I remember that I clearly and distinctly perceived it. The author distinguishes two situations. Situation I. You remember the conclusion, but you've forgotten the arguments. You lack the ability to reproduce the proof. Situation. Remember the conclusion, and you haven't forgotten the arguments. You retain the ability to reproduce the proof, even if you're not doing it right now. Descartes' language in the Fifth Meditation and Letter to Regius fits situation. He emphasizes remembering the perception, not necessarily the detailed argumentation at that moment, but implies the underlying structure is accessible. There's one tricky passage in the second replies where he talks about forgetting the arguments in question and later remember simply the conclusions. This sounds like situation. However, the author argues this isn't strong evidence against the reproducibility account. First, Descartes immediately refers the reader back to the Fifth Meditation, where situation is discussed. Second, the focus there might be on non-basic conclusions, which the reproducibility account handles. Third, the words oblivici or oublier might be used more loosely than complete forgetting. Overall, the textual evidence heavily favors the reproducibility account. Most passages align with the idea that unshakability via recollection depends on retaining the ability to reproduce the proof. Okay, so we've got this reproducibility account explaining weak unshakability. But Descartes also talks about immutability and permanence. How do these fit in? Are they just synonyms or different goals? First, immutability. Literal immutability would mean a belief that never changes once held. As we saw, strong unshakability doesn't guarantee this. You could forget. Weak unshakability also doesn't guarantee literal immutability. You could fail to use your preventative ability. The author suggests Descartes uses immutable in a technical sense, not literal. It refers to the conditions needed to ensure continuing unshakability. This likely involves the reproducibility account. Having the ability to reproduce the proof ensures you can maintain stability over time, preventing loss due to forgetfulness or failure to act. It's about guaranteeing future resilience, not just present resistance. Next, permanence. Even continuing weak unshakability doesn't guarantee permanence. You could still lose the belief if you don't act when the skeptical doubt arises. True permanence requires preemptive action, recognizing the threat of doubt, and exercising the reproducibility ability before the doubt takes root. Think of it like a self-defense expert. Their skill prevents loss, but only if they recognize the threat and react in time. Similarly, you need to recognize the impending skeptical doubt and reproduce the proof proactively to avoid losing your belief. The reproducibility account doesn't forbid achieving permanence. It provides the tools for it, assuming timely application. Alright, let's switch gears to philosophical objections. A major one is that Descartes' argument for the truth rule begs the question. Basically, the argument assumes what it's trying to prove. If you already assume clear and distinct perception is reliable, you won't doubt it. But isn't that circular? The psychological interpretation responds by shifting the focus. Descartes isn't necessarily claiming the argument is perfectly rigorous in an abstract, timeless sense. He's showing how scientific knowledge, characterized by unshakable belief, can be achieved for humans. Someone who has the continuing ability to reproduce the proof can choose not to use it. They might have scruples about the potential illusion, but they still achieve the goal of weak unshakability, and thus count as having scientific knowledge. The objection assumes that if you have the ability to reproduce the proof, you must use it whenever doubt arises. But the psychological interpretation allows for the possibility of choosing not to engage the psychological faculty, even if it means potentially falling into doubt later. The knowledge is secured by the ability, not necessarily by constant exercise. So, if you accept the possibility of entering an epistemological illusion by relying on irresistible belief without full justification, what's the alternative? Descartes' response as interpreted here is stark. The alternative is worse. The illusion is believing something is true because your mind is compelled to believe it, even if the reason for that compulsion, the argument against skepticism, is flawed. The alternative: don't exercise the faculty of clear and distinct perception at all. But wait, Descartes argues, that's not feasible. Why? Because clear and distinct perception is our primary tool for resolving conflicts within sense perception. Sense perception on its own is messy and contradictory. Clear and distinct perception provides the necessary psychological force to pick one belief and discard others, creating a coherent system. If you refuse to use clear and distinct perception, you lose the very tool needed to manage the chaos of sensory experience. The resulting belief system would be inherently unstable and unresolved. To avoid the illusion, you'd have to abandon reason itself. Descartes presents a choice: accept the psychological response and the potential epistemological cost, or face the greater cost of cognitive instability by refusing to use your reason. It's a trade-off between a potentially illusory certainty and unavoidable confusion. Finally, what's the big picture significance of this psychological take on Descartes? Some critics might say, hold on, this makes Descartes' rationalism depend on a fluke of human psychology, that our minds are wired to find clear and distinct perceptions irresistible. But the author argues this isn't a weakness. Rather, it highlights that for Descartes, rationalism is deeply intertwined with this specific psychological doctrine. His entire project hinges on the contrast between the irresistible nature of reason and the suppressible inclinations of sense perception. Interestingly, this might put Descartes and Hume in a surprising light. Both seem focused on achieving doxastic objectives like belief permanence or unshakability, and they define these objectives in psychological terms. Where they differ is in their assessment of which cognitive faculties can deliver these psychologically stable beliefs. Descartes bets on reason, Hume on a mix including sense, perception, and memory. So, this psychological interpretation offers a compelling alternative reading of how Descartes navigates the Cartesian circle, grounding his solution firmly in the dynamics of the human mind.